many of us have wanted to drop to our knees and start screaming at a funeral or just at the news of a death, but something holds us back from doing that. A lot of the most famous travel destinations on the planet are, in fact, tombs or they're ossuaries, and I think of Paris's catacombs or Egypt's pyramids, because the more you research this topic, the more you realize that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us when it comes to grief. The turning of the bones initially sounds like quite a confronting way of celebrating the dead, because you are very literally going to the family tomb and opening it up.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Good Grief. Today I'm joined by Anita Isalska, the author of this fantastic book that I'm holding by Lonely Planet called Lonely Planet's Guide to Death, Grief and Rebirth. So we're going to be opening this physically, but also through some of the stories that are illustrated so beautifully through here, and chatting all things grief, death and rebirth, as we usually do on this show. So if you're here for the first time, welcome. If you're a returning friend, family member, guest of ours, it's great to have you back. And I'd just ask that if you are returning, to, on your phone, wherever you're listening, Spotify or Apple, just to rate the podcast. Every 5-star rating helps us get these stories out to more people who are journeying through grief just like you and I. But without further ado, I want to invite Anita Isalska to the show. Welcome, Anita, all the way over in San Francisco. How are you doing today?
That's right. Thank you so much for having me, Ryan.
You're married to an Aussie, you're from the UK, and you're in San Francisco. How did that perfect mix occur?
Just very lucky. No, I was living in London after having moved there from Manchester, where I grew up, and that's where I found my Aussie, and he whisked me away initially to move to Australia, but after he got an opportunity over in California, we've lived there ever since. So we like to joke that we've met in the middle, so now both sets of families, equally have a one-way flight without any changes to visit us, but obviously brings its own challenges as well.
I love it. I mean, before we hit record, we were chatting, and you had the perfect concoction since the pandemic of these Zoom calls that you do weekly with your family, and you've continued them on. I didn't come on the podcast necessarily to chat about this, but I think it's kind of dovetails into how we express love and also continue relationship, especially when we've gone through loss. Can you just share how that came about and how you've managed to continue that?
Absolutely. During the pandemic, like so many people, we found ourselves as a family cut off from each other physically and socially, and looking for ways to have, firstly, a way to pass the time and mark the passage of time. Like, what is a reason to come together and notice another week passing, having that Friday night Zoom call? And it turned into a tradition that was very much keeping us all hanging on and supporting each other emotionally. And we've managed to sustain that incredibly. Years after the pandemic has ended, we're still meeting up on these Friday Zoom calls, and it's kind of an open house, so whoever's available on that particular daytime for some or evening for others, depending on your time zone, comes, checks in, talks about what they're up to and whether they've got a coffee in the hand or a wine in the hand. It's kind of an open living room for the family across borders, which is kind of such a difficult thing to achieve when more of us are living remotely distantly from our families and friends. It's really nice to be able to use the technology for good and for community.
I love that you guys do that. I just, all these memories now of those times a few years ago are coming back to me, of like all of these creative games that you do on Zoom, and all of the shenanigans that would happen. That's really, really special. Let's talk about this incredible piece of, I'm going to call it a piece of art. It is really a work of art that you've put together here with Lonely Planet. Now, I'm familiar with Lonely Planet. Just before we got connected, we'd bought a road trip guide to Australia for a friend of ours who'd retired, and so we gifted that to him. And like if you've had the pleasure of gifting one of these books to somebody, you almost want to buy a copy for yourself because they're just so damn good. This is a very different book for Lonely Planet to be talking about death, grief, and loss and rebirth. How did this idea come about?
It does sound like quite a departure from a travel publisher who has been guiding travelers around the world for, it's more than 50 years now, but it's got a really clear through line to what Lonely Planet is all about, which is uh, shedding light on how people around the world live and how you can respectfully encounter those cultures, learn from those cultures, and like share your own as well. So instead of being a literal guide that is going to take you to Bangkok or to Vancouver, this is a guide that is going to show you what different cultures in the world do that has in common with our own, about this very universal question of how do we grieve and how do we say goodbye to those that we've lost.
Yeah, and I mean, you've just mentioned it there as it is going to guide us. Like, already picking up the book, there's places in here I would never have thought of visiting. But now I think maybe when I travel with my family, we can incorporate some of these cultures and rituals and places into our travel. So I think it's a beautiful thing. Now, you've got your own personal journey with grief and loss. I would like to know, I guess, you mention it here in the book about the passing of your grandmother and also your uncle, but how those stories really did they happen as you were writing? Did they happen before? And yeah, did that culminate into you thinking, I'm really curious about death and grief and taking that further?
Yeah, well, that's great questions. I've been interested in how people celebrate the lives of those they've loved and who have passed on. I've been interested in that for a long time, and as a travel journalist, I've had the opportunity to visit some places that are incredibly beautiful and life-affirming, but on the flip side, travel takes you to some very dark places of mourning and commemoration as well, and a lot of the most famous travel destinations on the planet are, in fact, tombs or they're ossuaries. And I think of Paris's catacombs or Egypt's pyramids. These bucket list destinations are actually gigantic memorials to the dead. So I always had this in the back of my mind as a travel journalist. And this book is something that I've wanted to work on for a very long time. And I think it required the culmination of a few different things to actually make it the right moment to have this book. And one of these was the pandemic, which has really made us all think very deeply and differently about life and death and loss and what the meaning of life is. And in the wake of that, there's a real seismic change happening, I think, in grief, in how we express it and how we come together to question whether we're doing it in a way that is most healthy and helpful to ourselves. And I'm running parallel through that, seeing my own family change shape through a succession of losses made me reflect on just that really all-consuming impact that grief can have in completely changing a family's dynamics and moving relationships around, and the deep, profound emotional impact of going through that partly during the pandemic at a time where we're not able to come together and grieve collectively made me want to turn to the collective wisdom of the world. Like what are the best, most nourishing ways for our souls to remember the dead? How can we come together when we can't necessarily come together? And
So this sort of started through the pandemic, that you started to have this idea of bringing these stories and cultures together in the book. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely, because part of it is wanting to search for answers yourself, and you of course can't search for a single answer that's going to heal your own grief. There's nothing that's going to make you feel better, which is why it became this collective project, thinking through places I visited that are associated with death and what are the through lines between them. And that's where it gets really interesting, because most Lonely Planet guides are broken down by geography, but that doesn't make sense for a book like this, because the more you research this topic, the more you realize that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us when it comes to grief. And you'll see these echoes across completely geographically disparate places. So Uganda and Ireland might have a similar tradition of like death wailing and lamenting, and you think, what is the cultural connection between those places? Not obvious at the surface level, but there is something profoundly human about wanting to loudly, gutturally express something as movingly tragic and awful as the loss of a loved one. So finding that was very consoling in a way, because when you're alone and ruminating on your own grief, what better consolation could there be that across the world, this collective project of remembrance and mourning and consolation is happening all over the world? It's a darkly beautiful thing.
Yeah, darkly beautiful is a great way to describe it. And you mentioned a few things there. I think grief, one of the things that just unites us more than it divides us, because you don't have to say any words to understand, you know, what's somebody who's walking maybe a different path or a different loss, but that ultimate feeling of tragedy and separation from the person that you lost. The second thing that really stood out to me there, and it just blows my mind the more that we talk about travel but also grief, is like the pyramids. Yeah, they're on my bucket list to go and visit. The catacombs, like these have been around for eons, and do we connect them really with the fact that these cultures are celebrating or commemorating, etc., their dead ones? Or are we visiting them because they are these like extravagant monuments that have survived the dawns of time? You know, have we really connected that? You know, I don't know if we've done that in the West. We have them on our bucket list, but we don't really understand what we're there visiting.
It's a fascinating question, because at the surface level it sounds terribly morbid, doesn't it? That all
Totally.
of these famous locations are associated with death, and they're like cemeteries. If I told you that I was going on a big cemetery tour of the world, you might think I was a little particular or a little bit odd.
And people might not go with you on that tour, right? You know, they might say, "Oh,
exactly,
I'll go to Fiji or Hawaii." You know,
100%. But I think any monument or memorial that is dealing with death is also expressing something really interesting about life and how a culture expressed itself architecturally or artistically. So when we see the pyramids, we're marveling at how the ancient pharaohs lived and what their beliefs about the afterlife were, but we're also marveling at how this incredible construction was put together and the landscape. And that's why when you're a student of death and funeral traditions, you're also a student of how a culture expresses itself in everyday life. And it kind of draws that circle between life and death and the whole journey along the way.
and another great mention is the Taj Mahal as the burial place for his wife, which I had no idea until I stepped foot inside the Taj Mahal, you know, and you learn these things. And so I guess I'm probably speaking this out and learning as I'm chatting with you that sometimes we're drawn to them for the attraction and the monument and the scale or the beauty of what's been built, and then we learn about what's happened there. I think maybe Egyptian culture, I'm blanket assuming this for everyone, that we have a more of an understanding that was, you know, Egyptians mummifying their dead because we've been taught that from a young age. What was your, I mean, when you put together a book like this, first of all, there's no way you can contain all of the rituals and ceremonies in one book. First of all, how did you do that? And second of all, how did you go about choosing and selecting the ones that are inside here?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a lifetime of work, maybe several lifetimes, to try and capture all of the myriad ways that different cultures and belief systems mourn their dead. That would be certainly quite an undertaking, much thicker a volume than the one that you're holding in your hands.
Yes.
But in putting it together, two important ingredients. The first one being a fantastically talented editor, Janine Eberly, who was helping to sculpt this information thematically and figure out the best way to whittle it down. And secondly, to ensure that like the widest possible diversity of traditions was being represented and not shying away from the ones that can feel quite confronting if you're unfamiliar with it. So it would be very easy to stick to the positive, uplifting burial traditions, which I'm a big fan of, having attended a New Orleans jazz funeral and Day of the Dead celebrations. I think these are both magnificently colorful and celebratory ways of remembering the dead, but not being afraid to talk about some fairly visceral other alternative traditions, such as like bodily modification in some cultures, and sky burials, which involve leaving a body to nature, and wanting to dig into what is universal about traditions that might seem to some audiences unsettling or a little confronting.
So I want to go there in a moment. I want to pull apart some of these ceremonies and rituals because there are a few in here that have really caught my attention that I'm highly curious about and I want to know more about. The first, I guess, we're talking about death and grief here, but I want to know from yourself, how do you feel understanding death helps us live better?
That's a great question. I think on an individual level, there's nothing quite like the awareness of your mortality to make you declare your love, go for that job, take that trip. I think we're all passingly aware of mortality of ourselves and loved ones, but it never quite hits you with the reality that I think it could, in order to inform living a better and more moral life as well. I often think about, I don't think that mourning and suffering are necessary to live a moral life, but I do think that in cultures where you have an experience of collective mourning, it does propel you to want to protect the next generation from sorrow. I often think of Hiroshima in Japan as a city that, perhaps counterintuitively, turned out to be the most uplifting destination I visited in Japan because, although it's associated historically with having been the site of a terrible tragedy, the atomic bombing, the people in Hiroshima are so activated by peace activism and a desire for cross-cultural understanding that the energy that inheritance of mourning has given them is propelling them towards a more peaceful future. And that's something I reflect on a lot when I think about how does grief affect me? What smaller level does it enable me to lead a more moral life? And I think the answer is that widening of empathy that you get when you lose someone that you love. When I've mourned people in my own family, I gain an awareness that I might be going through something that feels singular, but I'm walking down the street and I'm probably surrounded by people also carrying these enormous burdens.
That's right.
It becomes kind of a superpower of empathy, and imagine if we could harness that as we all go about our everyday lives, assuming or believing that everyone around us is carrying something quite heavy. How would that change how we interact with one another? How much more kind and more collaborative would we be?
Yeah, the world would be a different place. You made me think of two things there. Michael Jackson, the song Man in the Mirror, just reflecting upon, ourselves, but then projecting that onto others, like you've just said. And the second thing is Hiroshima. I'm looking forward to visiting there one day. The largest probably, or the closest thing I can relate to that is probably the 9/11 site, New York City, and visiting the memorial and doing the tour. But just that you don't have to talk to the hundreds of people that are there at any one time when you are, but the collective understanding of the loss, the sorrow, the pain, but then also the landmark there to say, it doesn't physically say this, but almost saying, let's change the way we move forward. Let's remember these people that we lost and let's continue to love and further relationships and do good. So I'm looking forward to visiting Hiroshima. There are 4 pillars in this book that I find quite interesting, and I'm curious to know how these came about. So the 4 pillars are celebrating, commemorating, mourning, and offering. How did they first come about, and why did you choose those?
I think ultimately it came down to trying to find what the core essences of these very, very outwardly different seeming traditions were. And the more, if you imagine just moving a lot of chess pieces around a board, trying to make them all make sense and coalesce, right. I think ultimately it felt that there's I don't ever want to break it down into the different stages of mourning because I think they can vary dramatically for everyone. And
that's what I noticed you didn't do. So you didn't go for any of the publicized stages or anything like that. These are quite unique in the sense that I'm seeing them here organized in this way for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I think with the travel perspective on, I think of places that are very much like celebrating and upholding a memory. Like, how do we memorialize someone? And it's through often kind of flamboyant or ostentatious tombs that you see throughout history.
Sure.
And like increasingly hyper-modern versions of that. So in countries where you might have these like skyscraper style memorials that contain urns of ashes in that kind of vertical orientation rather than in a graveyard. So thinking about how do we outwardly express this in a way that kind of defies time feels like something that is universal, right? Because death is the one state that no one reports back from, and yet it's the one state that, in a way, we're kind of defying that mortality all the time by creating these semi-permanent ways to remember. And that instinct to almost counter or defy the finality of death by creating a memorial to it seems to be like across all cultures, whether it's creating a skyscraper or carving a monument or creating the Taj Mahal. So that felt like a very universal experience. Sure. And
so let's talk then. I want to hear some of these stories a bit more specifically. So in the area of celebration, you mentioned the Day of the Dead and the Jazz Festival, etc. I'd like to hear about the turning of the bones in Madagascar. Can you share about that?
Yeah, the turning of the bones initially sounds like quite a confronting way of celebrating the dead, because you are very literally going to the family tomb and opening it up. Like on an auspicious day, all of the family will gather together, have a celebration where the dead are tended to. And this is like in a very physical way, like the bones will be brought out of a tomb, they will be cared for, they might be toured around a village to remind the past person of where they used to be. You might even consult with them on matters to do with your daily life and let your mother-in-law know what the latest is, or tell your granddad how the finances for the local farm are going. And this is it's a collection of different emotions, I would say. There's the kind of catharsis of all of the welled up grief is culminating in this one day. It's an opportunity to express all of the emotions that may have been kind of bottled up and failed to find expression. But it's also a celebration, because you can imagine this thing that we all, I think, in our hearts want, which is a homecoming of someone. You want that one last chance to see someone. And while, needless to say, this isn't the real deal, but this is acting out that beautiful reunion between yourself and your departed loved one. And I think many cultures have this, have a tradition where there's this liminal space between the living and the dead for maybe one day a year, or in the case of the turning of the bones in Madagascar, it's once every few years, where there's the stars align just right for this to be the occasion. And the idea that there's this membrane between the living and the dead that is at its thinnest on one day only, I think it's very human and very beautiful, because it draws a line and forces us to not dwell too deeply in the living, in the world of the dead. You don't let yourself get swallowed up by your grief, but at the same time, it creates just enough space to say, on this day, I am going to be with my past loved one. I'm going to actively grieve rather than passively grieving, which is feeling the emotions, maybe not letting them find that full expression. You'll actively grieve by being with the remains, by caring for them as you did in life, by reshrouding a body, for example. I think there's something very moving about that, even though it seems, I think, to many Western sensibilities where we try and shy away from bodily functions, like something that might be out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, I think people would be calling the police if you saw a bunch of people down at the local cemetery, bringing bones out and doing some of these acts and rituals, right? It would be so foreign to us in the West. And it's just such a a fascinating culture and way of doing it. And I think it's a balance. I can see on one hand how it allows you to forecast that day when you're going to share things, when you're going to express things, but then it can also put this pressure on getting that day really perfect. And my personality would be like, well, what if I don't get it right? Now I've got to wait a few more years. Very, very interesting. Were you going to add to that just then?
Yeah, I was going to just remark that while it's something that I personally find a little difficult to wrap my head around, one area where I think my own culture is the one I can speak to in the UK, I think we've stepped so far away from the bodily side of death that I think it can make it harder for us to grieve properly.
I agree.
So maybe there's a halfway house between all of these, because many of us have experiences of grief where the body is whisked out of sight. There's a very abrupt departure between you and your loved one, and you're expected to just absorb that new reality completely. But traditions that create this twilight space in between, like the turning of the bones in Madagascar, or like even any traditions where there's a prolonged wake or watching over of the body for a few days, like Irish wakes, or in Jewish funeral customs.
Or like the Maori tradition, where they'll actually lay with the body for a number of days.
Isn't that a beautiful and gentle way to send your loved one off into the next life, by not having such an abrupt rupture between you and them?
I was exactly going to say the same thing, abrupt. And obviously, depending on the type of death, you can perform, you have the ability to perform some of these rituals. Sometimes you don't. In my case, with my dad, it didn't happen. It was very sudden, and we didn't get to witness or see the body after that. But if someone would have, let's just say, I'm hypothesizing, if my dad had died of natural, old age, for example, and we had a chance to lay with the body, it still would have been foreign because it's not part of our culture inherently, and so it's very strange to wrestle with that. But when I do see my Kiwi friends that head home to commemorate their loved ones, I just think, wow, I think that's a really beautiful way to love and celebrate their loved one, but then also be with everybody else. Okay, so that's some 100%. That's some of the things inside of the celebration category. One that really caught my attention in the mourning pillar was people that are paid to weep and mourn.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, right? Because we think of mourning and grieving as so intensely personal that it couldn't be expressed by anyone other than you, but there's a number of different cultures where paid mourning has long been historically part of a tradition, and this ranges from China to Ireland to Uganda, and there are several different reasons for having paid mourners, all of which kind of make a certain amount of sense. And one of them is essentially having a mouthpiece to express emotions in all of their torrid, uncontrollable intensity in a way that you might not want to do yourself at a gathering filled with your loved ones.
Sure.
So many of us have wanted to drop to our knees and start screaming at a funeral or just at the news of a death, but something holds us back from doing that. That
Totally.
tends to be propriety, place, not wanting to upset others around us. Maybe there's younger people we may not want to traumatize with the spectacle of our own grief. And so what better way to ensure that the full-throatedness of that grief finds expression? Having a paid mourner whose daily bread and butter is to vocalize grief.
That is amazing. That really is.
It's definitely one of the oldest professions as well, and there's other reasons to have them. I certainly found during my research that creating a spectacle that demonstrated just how powerfully this person was loved, how important they were to the community, is another way to get several paid mourners in, because you're creating a visual of how influential or how beloved they were, and that's quite fascinating as well. And I think in the Irish tradition, it has such a beautifully distinct funeral song tradition attached to it musically that you would almost want to bring a professional in to vocalize that grief.
Wow. So, I mean, if people are listening and they're looking for some part-time work or even full-time work, I mean, hey, there's a gig out there that exists where you can mourn other people's losses and get paid for it. And is this, do you know, is this happening in many continents around the world? Like you mentioned a couple, but like, is this kind of common if you look for it?
It's more common than you think. I think in many countries it is starting to like fade out somewhat, and I don't believe that it's as much of a thing, for example, in Ireland as it once was. It's
Sure.
almost completely faded out, but I think the emotions behind why it exists are still very strongly represented in grieving traditions. You know, that need to vocalize, that need to express very deeply.
Yeah, totally. I'm thinking back to a time where a friend of mine, we were driving on the way to go rock climbing here in Australia, and there was myself, my brother, and my wife. And the news came through to my brother while I was driving that a good friend of ours had passed away. That, you know, he was in hospital in ICU. And I'm driving the car, and I sort of had to say to them, guys, like, I've got to let this out. Somehow just block your ears for a moment. And I just had to like vocally scream at the top of my lungs. That was the feeling that just rose up. And so I can totally see how, you know, in this setting, having that need for somebody else to vocalize that when you might not feel the same way makes total sense.
Yeah, and it does make me think that maybe we're cultivating a culture where people are expected to button their lips or keep their grief to a certain volume level, which is obviously pretty harmful to so many of us. We want to find expression to our grief, but we feel inhibited for doing so. Why is that? Because this is a universal experience that unfortunately we will all go through that at some point, and yet it can feel so lonely and also so constraining. And like I reflected a lot on why this is, and all of these different grieving traditions around the world seem to be trying to fill those gaps and uncertainties and find different ways to express things when we're not able to ourselves.
And do you feel in your own grief that as you've researched and become curious and put together this book, do you feel you've been able to grieve differently and incorporate certain elements as you've gone along, even though it might be a year or 5 years after, for example, like you still are able to incorporate some of them?
Yeah, there are definitely things that I've taken into my own mental toolkit, though I wish I could say I'd found, you know, that healing balm that we all crave when we're going through grief. Towards the end of researching the book, I was putting the finishing touches to the intro and got some horrible news that a lifelong friend and mentor had passed away, and I was in pieces and was thinking to myself darkly, I should be an expert at grief now. Why is this still hitting me like a ton of bricks? I should know exactly what to do in order to heal myself or to make myself feel better. But of course, there's nothing that can protect you from that initial wave of grief when you hear that news. But what I did take away from this that I've been able to use myself is like actively grieving and making space for active grief, because many of us think of grief as this process that just happens to us and we have to navigate it somehow, or we have to continue living our lives around it until it hopefully fades. But creating a space to actively remember, to actively share memories, whether that's at a family event where you're all raising a drink to a person, like we raise toasts to my uncle whenever we gather together as a family, and that's a way to actively grieve. Or for myself personally, gathering together mementos and talking about those with your partner is a way to actively grieve, rather than just suddenly having them come to mind and finding that the tears are coming. You don't know why you're suddenly starting to think about this. You're in the car, you're on the way to a big meeting, and there's no way to relieve that. But finding spaces to in a setting where you feel safe, you feel listened to, and you can look through the photos, you can hold the mementos or the old gifts or whatever it is.
And you even talk
doing
about
that, I think.
Yeah, you even talk about keeping a seat at the family table. Can you share a little bit about that story with your family?
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up as a Polish-British Catholic family, and we've inherited a lot of the old ways from Poland. And like one of the traditions in Poland is, especially on Christmas Eve, is to leave an empty seat at the table. And this has symbolized a lot of different things over the years. Some people think it's simply that Polish hospitality, that if someone random comes to your door, there's a space for them at the table. But it's also symbolized people lost in war or people who were exiled to Siberia during war, and many of whom never returned. Families would leave a seat at the table just in that hope that they would one day return. And for families like my own, it's come to symbolize that person who is missing that you so dearly wish could be there. And once my grandma passed away, who was like just the ultimate matriarch of our family, the true architect of the entire family, who was dominating every social gathering and could have us all screaming in laughter with a single one-liner, or endlessly losing her handbag or whatever it was. She was just awesome. An icon of very theatrical moments. Like her loss was just this sudden descending of silence on these family gatherings. So the empty chair really began to represent her sense of self, kind of encapsulated in that space. And then as further losses happened in the family, it becomes this seat of everyone you wish were there, the friends past and present who you wish could be occupying that chair. So I think it's a beautiful way to hold space in quite a literal way.
Yeah, and you know what?
Just as you're holding it mentally.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say thank you for that, because that idea alone is one that I want to take and use in sort of our family as well. So thanks for sharing that. I just love a small but highly practical and valuable thing that we can use in grief. So I think that'll speak to a lot of our audience that are listening to this. Continuing with some of the pillars, I've got a couple more stories I'd love you to divulge on. So in the offering pillar, there's a chapter on Swedish death cleaning. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating way to live as well as to prepare for death. Margareta Magnusson, the author of this book, has espoused a philosophy to live a lighter and more orderly life, but also not bequeath your family all of your old belongings and your attic full of old coats from the 70s. So yes. She recommends this practice of death cleaning, which is essentially clearing out your attic while you're still relatively young. But as those years pass, hold on to those souvenirs only to the point where they're still giving you active enjoyment. And at that point, you Marie Kondo them. You give them away, you donate, you consign things to a charity shop, and the goal is that you're unburdening the people who will come after you. You won't have your children or your friends or anyone else in your family trying to deal with whatever you've amassed in your life.
Yeah, totally.
But it also has these really beautiful ways to ensure that you're appreciating your life as well. What's the point of having souvenirs if you're not turning them over in your hands and reflecting on what they gave you? And are you living fully if you're encumbered by all of your belongings? Because the more stuff you acquire, you can feel quite hemmed in by it, especially as we get older. If you have an entire shelf full of books, you haven't read some of them, it can feel a little claustrophobic, like there is this unfinished business, and you can unburden yourself of that and live a lighter and more easygoing existence if you get rid of some of your physical belongings.
It's such a great idea, and I think, grief aside, it's a healthy idea anyway, because we just accumulate stuff. And like you said, the bookshelf with books we haven't read, I think most of us would be guilty of that. My laptop is currently sitting on a pile of books, and there's probably 4 in like half the pile that hasn't been read just yet. I think about my 98-year-old grandfather, very independent, still lives on his own, but his house, the stuff that is in the house and the garage, and we tried a few years ago to sort through some of that, but it continues to grow, and it leaves the people behind you with a workload and also a lot of challenging decisions when you're trying to reconcile loss and navigate grief. And now you're deciding, do we keep this blue pen or do we keep the red pen? And it's decisions that ultimately we shouldn't need to be making, especially if you have to move those belongings on very quickly. So I love this idea of Swedish death cleaning.
It can be such a wrenching process, and if the idea that you can spare someone else from having to make those decisions at a time when they've got the ultimate decision fatigue and they're at the ultimate vulnerability that it's possible to be, there's something soothing about that as well. It's like you're giving a gift of clear-mindedness and simplicity to the people that will follow you, and that feels like a good in itself.
And you've given permission as well to let go of some of those things that your family might think, oh, he really cherished that or she really cherished that, but they didn't, and it was okay to let go. There's a lot to this, I think, that's really helpful. And especially, chatting with everyone inside of our Good Grief audience, it's one of the biggest things that when somebody dies, what do we do with their belongings? And it's different for everybody. It's how long is a piece of string. And so...
Yeah, because it really takes on a sacred significance. When someone passes, everything of theirs it's harder to get rid of because they've now passed. But if they've been able to make some of those decisions themselves, then and minimize some of that decision making for those who come next, then that's only a good thing. And I think the mental benefits for the person who is doing that death cleaning are enormous as well, because I certainly feel trapped by my own belongings sometimes, and I wonder how much a minimal existence could also heighten my own clarity of focus, of intent in how I live my life, and it makes us all more nimble and less easily distracted as well.
Yeah, it's why Marie Kondo is such a superstar, right? That's why she is who she is. So,
although I did read that Marie Kondo had kind of lapsed on her own minimalist ways. There was an article about that. So
I'll give her some grace.
It's nice to know that these modern day saints also manage to waver from time to time.
Well, it's the same thing with you reflecting on your mentor passing and thinking I should have grief in a box, know exactly what to roll out when it happens. Even those of us that are fully engulfed in it, we don't have it all together. It's different every time, every person that we lose.
Exactly. Even with the best advice in the world, the best support network, grief is one of those things that there's no clear blueprint to guide your way. There's things you can try. There's a community you can lean into. That's maybe the one constant throughout every grieving tradition, is that grief can't happen in a silo, and whether that's your own family community or your friends or an online community, it absolutely has to be shared in order to be healed. That's maybe the only thing that's common to everyone as a griever.
Yeah, what you just said there was really powerful. It has to be shared to be healed. I think that's incredible. I want to talk about commemorating, and one of the other stories that caught my attention were the Ghana fantasy coffins. Now,
what a way to go out.
Now, I just want to paint the picture for our listeners. The introduction page to this chapter has got a huge Samsung mobile phone on it. Can you share more?
Absolutely. The originator of this incredible form of art is Kane Kwe, who took his inspiration from these biers or trains that would be used to carry around chieftains, these kind of decorative vehicles, and essentially translated that form of tribal art into modern day coffins, which can be shaped in almost anything of your imagining, whether it's vaguely coffin shaped or not. It could be a shooting star, a pack of cigarettes, it could be a bird, a plane. Anything associated with either your life or your aspirations in life could be the coffin shape that you meet your maker in. And there's something very inspiring but wickedly humorous about it as well, because the different types of coffin shapes that people choose, for their loved ones, it might be something that was left undone. Maybe it's a plane because they never got to take that trip, or maybe it's their mobile phone because they were never seen without it. So there's an opportunity to inject a little bit of
they never replied back to my
humor
text.
And a little bit of
yeah,
exactly, something that's relatable or funny about that person could just as much be the inspiration for the shape of their coffin as something more spiritual. And I think that ability to honor, but also do so in a way that is authentic and has a little levity about it, is very, very beautiful indeed.
And I assume they can go both ways. If your loved one didn't express something in terms of how they would like to be buried, etc., you can decide on that coffin, or maybe they get the choice of saying, well, I love speedboats, and so I'd love to be buried in a coffin-shaped speedboat.
Yeah, typically the family will decide, but certainly a lot of people will make those wishes known well ahead of their deaths, because they've got their eye on that, that airplane-shaped coffin, or that ferry that's going to ferry them to the afterlife. Yeah.
Have you thought about this? If you could be buried in a coffin, what would it be?
I mean, I think I would want some kind of fantastically ornately carved peacock or
awesome.
exotic bird to ferry me off into the great beyond. I think, something with wings to kind of symbolize that passing on would be beautiful. But never know whether my folks will end up putting me in a mobile phone or a laptop, because I spend too much time on my laptop.
Well, that's me as well. What about the pillar of mourning? And one of the things here, which we were speaking about just before we jumped on air, I was kind of like, I really want to hear about this one. But the ritual amputation that goes on, I believe, in Papua New Guinea.
That's right, yeah. So it's a tradition that's very much fading out of view, but it is still practiced in some remote tribes where, after a very close loss in a family, the ritual amputation of a finger or part of a digit takes place to symbolize just the enormity of that loss. And without going into too much graphic detail, the amputation tends to be done over a period of time, first cutting off the blood flow and or potentially just being severed, but the result is that there are still, especially women, this is a practice that is most common among women. There are older women that you can see with multiple missing digits because they've experienced multiple losses. And this, at the surface level, this seems like a frightening, potentially barbaric, worryingly unhygienic. There's all sorts of accusations you could lobby at this, but as with every tradition that I researched for the book, there's always a kernel of understanding in it, which is that bodily impact of grief that I think so many of us don't appreciate until we feel it ourselves. The physical impact of grief on our fatigue, like almost physical pains that you can experience, and shortness of breath. There are so many ways that grief manifests in the body that that urge to formalize someone's loss by permanently altering your body, it's oddly relatable for anyone who's ever contemplated getting a memorial tattoo of a loved one. That's a more common equivalent of wanting to mark the body.
Yes.
A painful experience that is just as permanent.
Just as permanent, that's right.
A memory, And I think that's that feeling that you carry a loss in your body and you physically are forever changed by a loss is clearly symbolized by this practice of ritual amputation.
I can totally relate. Not that I want to lose any digits, but I'm sure you can relate too, the feeling of there is a deep pain inside of me that others can't see. But if only they could see it, sometimes it would help maybe bridge the gap of them understanding where I'm at. And so I can see how a physical representation of that, especially something so public as your hands, where you shake hands, you high five, you hug, yourself will be forever reminded, and your friends, family, and those around you will be reminded, especially where it's a culture that it's understood and you could see, oh wow, you've gone through multiple losses. And maybe that opens conversation, I'm not sure, in Papua New Guinea, or maybe that's just a known understanding of the deep pain and loss that they've been through. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, because there are so many ways in funeral traditions that people are trying to wear their heart on their sleeve. There's formal types of clothing you might wear to a funeral. You might tear your clothing in certain traditions just so that there's this outward symbol of some some darkness has arrived, or something has been broken, something has been forever altered. And when we see those signifiers in others, if we understand that culture, we know to give them empathy, we know to give them space, we know to give them grace as much as we can. So there is something inarguable about seeing that physical symbol of grief on someone else, and I think definitely elicits empathy and makes us reflect on our own losses as well when we see it symbolized in such a stark way.
Totally, yep. And I mean, you mentioned tearing of clothing. You know, often funerals in the West, at least, are known for being heavily clad in black. You know, I think that's changed. I think that's one of the things in the West that has changed quite a lot. My wife's family, when they had their funeral for my wife's mother, they told everyone to wear bright colours to celebrate because she was, you know, full of colour in her life. But I think of Johnny Cash and his song "The Man in Black," and he says that I wear the black for the beaten down, the broken, the poor, the dying, and I'll never wear bright colours on my back because somebody needs to be the man in black. And I think about that, and it holds resemblance, and it definitely carries a weight of that public outward appearance of mourning to let people know. I want to know from you, what culture or ritual really caught you off guard the most?
That's a great question. I think wherever humor is formalized into a grieving tradition, that sounds very uncomfortable or transgressive from my own cultural heritage of Polish and British mourning is very stiff upper lip. It's very Catholic inflected. It's very somber. It's very sorrowful. So encountering traditions where there's humor inflected into the process made a certain kind of sense once I got to understand it, but definitely caught me off guard initially. There's a beautiful cemetery in Romania called the Merry Cemetery, and it's brightly colored. It's, instead of being these like bone white tombs with somber inscriptions on it, it's gorgeous cartoon-like portraits of people as they were in life, often doing racy or transgressive things. So you might just as likely have grandma filling her basket with raspberries as someone hitting the bottle, or perhaps even having slightly more dubious aspects of their life memorialized in verse. There's some tombs there where someone's propensity to look at other men's wives is written on his tomb.
Wow.
And it raises an eyebrow, it raises a laugh, and I think what's beautiful about it is remembering people as they were in all of their flawed and magnificent glory is much more healing to a griever than trying to don't ever speak ill of the dead. Now they've passed to this other state where we can't be real about the good and the bad, the funny and the dark about this person. And there's also humor is incredibly cathartic. I think many of us have been to a funeral or an event where someone kind of had an inappropriate reaction to their grief. They might have laughed or stifled a laugh, or someone made an ill-timed joke under their breath. And this is something that needs to find expression. So traditions that formalize that are very, very interesting to me. There's another one that comes to mind on the humor theme is Gai Jatra in Nepal is this annual festival of grief that involves stand-up comics and where children have moustaches drawn on them. And it's awesome. A celebration of laughter and life as much as it is of grief and remembrance. And it came about when an ancient king, Pratap Mala, wanted to essentially show his grieving queen that others were mourning and try to cheer her up a bit. And it's now become this annual festival that is peculiarly, from my perspective, upbeat for something that is remembering the dead. So I definitely found that confronting, but also very profound and beautiful.
I think from what you've shared, Romania and the Merry Cemetery, did I get that correct? I think that's on my list. I think that would be quite interesting, a place to visit. What about, as we start to wrap up, I'd love to know on your grief journey, now having researched these wide varieties of cultures, what culture would you be most drawn to if you could wind back the clock to go through the experience again? What culture would you be drawn most to go, I'd actually lean into this culture?
I think if it were my own send-off, I would certainly want it to be a New Orleans jazz funeral.
Okay.
I think New Orleans is a city that's very, very aware of death and wears death on its sleeve very vividly. But it's one where celebration of life is absolutely at the foremost. It's a hedonistic place in some ways, and it's a place where you want to dance someone out in style. And in a New Orleans funeral, there's equal parts sorrow and celebration, where a great community outpouring of grief happens, where people who may not have even known the deceased will join the second line of a funeral procession and dance and twirl their parasols and tap their feet along to the sound of a jazz band. And the idea of being in a culture where it's not only acceptable but encouraged to celebrate the life of any member of that community as if it were one of your own is something really profound and wonderful.
And you can't go wrong with some good jazz either. So I think I'm with you on that. A nice big party where everyone's welcome, whether they know me or not. Let's celebrate.
What a way to go out.
Yeah, I agree. I would have loved to be in New Orleans when when that festival or day happened. It would have been amazing. It wasn't quite the day, but I can still sense it while I was there. They've definitely got an understanding of death and the afterlife and a few different things going on there. Quite interesting. Anita, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time putting together this book. I'm excited to see the conversations that this brings up, because it's bright pink. For those listening, it is bright pink with a what is the skull that's on here? This is a...
Yeah, this is it's the La Catrina symbol, which is associated with Day of the Dead in Mexico, which is this beautiful, ornate, floral skull, which you'll see on everything from candies and cookies to altar pieces on Mexico's Day of the Dead festival. And
so, yes, I'm looking forward to this being on our coffee table. It's a very different book than the other books that we've got around, and for it to start conversations with all of the people that join us here. So thank you so very much, and thanks for being vulnerable and sharing your story, but also the stories of all of these cultures. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, we really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Man, I've definitely enjoyed this episode. I've got a lot more to read inside of this book in front of me, and we'll put the link below so that you can grab that. If you found it helpful and you've reached this far in the episode, give us a thumbs up on YouTube or rate us on Spotify and Apple. That would be incredible. From the bottom of our hearts, Kaylee and I just want to say thank you. We love you, and we can't wait to see you in the next episode. Bye for now.